It's actually an interesting concept. I've been thinking about this a little bit more lately, whether it's becoming famous or something like that. Like you can't, because people say to me sometimes, they'll be like, "Oh, aren't you famous?" And I'm like, I don't think it works like that. Like I don't just become famous, or I'm not famous. I'm only famous if you think I'm famous. So it's like maybe legend is similar in a sense that you don't sign up. You can't go sign up to be a legend. Like you can become a singer, you can become a race car driver. You can't become famous, or you can't become a legend. That has to be in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that, anybody who's a public figure has had that experience of, in one set of circumstances, you're incredibly, you walk into one room or a bar or a restaurant, and everybody in that bar and restaurant or party knows who you are. And then you walk next door and no one knows who you are. And it's actually like the first few times that happens, it can be quite humbling, but it's really healthy just to remember, like, the majority of the people on the planet kind of largely have no idea who we are, which is
Right.
exactly how it should be.
Right.
I think, like, because I don't know what your experience was like, but when I first started becoming a public figure, to my great shame, I sort of succumbed to the narcissism and the self-involvement that comes along with that. Where for a while, I'm ashamed to say, I expected people to sort of know who I was and to treat me differently, and that it's not a healthy way to live. I mean, we look at our culture, and there's so many public figures who are sort of destroyed by being public figures. It's very, I mean, it's not just confusing. Sometimes it brings out the worst parts of our personalities. So I am glad that I personally have sort of gone past that. Where, like, I guess I'm still a public figure, but it's not necessarily how I think of myself on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Yeah. You mean you're not passing by the mirror going, "Hey, legend. Hey, famous guy. Hey, superstar."
No, I walk by the mirror and I'm like, who invited the old guy into my house?
Don't worry. As we all age, we're all thinking they're like, "Whoa, where'd that wrinkle come from?" I will tell you that I see you as a legend. You can only speak from your experience, but what was it that led you down that sort of path where you're like, you expected people to know who you are? You expected certain things. Have you realized what it was, or was it more a matter of just sort of alchemizing that and processing and shifting it?
Well, I mean, when I first started making music, I never expected to have a career as a musician. When I was, you know, in my teens and junior high school and high school, I played in little punk rock bands. And like a good night for us was playing to 10 people, playing to 15 people.
Mm.
The first single I ever released with my punk rock band in Connecticut, we sold 100 copies.
That's
And
awesome.
we thought that was pretty great. That meant 100 people had gone out of their way to buy our record. And I was like, wow, this is the pinnacle. Like, it's not going to get any better than this. So when in the 90s, when I started having more sort of broader success, it was so unexpected, and it played to all of my, and maybe this is very, very obvious, but it played to all of my insecurities. It played to my lack of self-worth, my feelings of inadequacy. And somehow I felt that, if people were nice to me, if people wanted to date me, if people invited me to their parties, it sort of gave me this external sort of validation. And as is often the case, I became way too attached to it, because, I had grown up, my mom and I were on food stamps and welfare. I was, a little insecure kid growing up. And then suddenly, when you're on the receiving end of attention,
Mhm.
especially glamorous attention,
Mhm.
it can be really corrupting. It's because it's so attractive.
Mm. I feel like for myself and just the things that I've gone through in life, and especially over the last year, like I've realized just how much like our parents and childhood has, I mean, it's really the root of everything. It's like the most complicated giant box that lives underground in the subconscious and just wreaks havoc through patterns until you recognize it.
Yeah, and it's hard because the patterns, who we are and who we were, how we were formed as children, we're rarely are we capable of even recognizing those patterns because they're so familiar. And it's only, like we become adults and we start almost like encountering the consequences of those patterns, whether it's in relationships, whether it's with addiction, whether it's with friends, what have you. And then suddenly, whether it's through therapy, whether it's through self-help, sobriety, what have you, like hopefully we learn enough about ourselves to sort of at least identify those old patterns and work to move past them insofar as we can. It's certainly obviously much easier said than done.
If it was easy, we would all be healed, and it would be one quick moment, and we'd be like, "Oh yes, yeah, I forgive you, Mom. I forgive you, Dad." But it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that easy because, like you said, they're just like they're patterns. They're ingrained in us, and they're almost like invisible because there's such patterns. And yeah, I mean, life is just such a journey. I mean, such a complicated journey. I it's not
And
easy.
one thing I've been sort of hopefully learning lately, and I don't know why this is the most self-evident thing I could ever say, is realizing that it's a complicated journey for everyone. Because when I was growing up, I thought like I was the only confused person. I was the only scared person. I was the only insecure person. I was the only person who really was filled with doubts. And then time passes and you realize, oh, everybody is. It's just unfortunately we live in a culture where most of us are really good at pretending otherwise. People pretending they're smarter than they actually are, cooler than they actually are, sexier than they actually are. Like, so it is sort of nice remembering that every human being on the planet, regardless of, how they were born, where they were born, like everybody has their own experience of the human condition, and it's confusing to everybody.
Like, was there a moment where you realized that you like finally like freed yourself from this self-inflicted burden that you're alone?
Oddly, I did. I was driving, and it came just a few years ago. The actual sort of like the physical realization of this. I was driving from Los Angeles down to Palm Springs. I was playing at Coachella, and I was driving on the 10, and I'm sure you've spent some time on the 10. And the 10 between Los Angeles and Palm Springs is gross. Like, it's just, especially like when it's hot and there's traffic, like it's awful. And I was, sitting in my car, feeling sorry for myself because the traffic was terrible. And I was, like everything outside was ugly and brown. And then I looked around at everybody else in traffic and I had this realization. I was like, oh, everyone hates this. Like, it's not just me. In fact, most people probably hate it way more than I do. Because, like I was leaving my nice home to go play at a festival and I was going to stand on stage in front of 40 or 50,000 people. Like I'm not looking, it's clearly like my circumstances were different than most other people's, and realizing like, okay, if this is unpleasant for me, like I'm in my nice car, the air conditioning is going, I'm listening to music and I am unhappy, just think how much less happy the people around me are. And it gave me this sense of just very simple, and I hope this doesn't sound insincere, but really simple compassion. Just this realization, like these, everybody is struggling. I certainly can't take my problems too seriously, especially when people are dealing with problems that are so much worse and more serious than mine.